All right, so I'm Beck Mitchell. Thank you for having me here to speak with you today. And as Claire said, I'm talking to you about tuberous sclerosis complex and really how it fits into child development. I'm going to begin by giving you an overview of child development and how it fits into TSC, really just to orientate you to some terms and ideas, and then talk to you about the TAN checklist. We're going to look at what it is, why you might choose to use it, and how you can use it. I've then been asked to give you a bit of an overview of the management of developmental problems in TSC and childhood. Now, this is a huge topic, so I'm going to try and give you a first principles approach and we'll see how we go with that. And then finally, I'm going to take a little bit of time to give you a plug for the DOT study, or the Developmental Outcomes in Tuberous Sclerosis study, which is happening here at the Children's Hospital. So, when we talk about child development, we're really talking about different aspects of a child's function which happen in really typical and predictable ways as children grow and as their brains and their bodies mature. And there are really four major domains of child development which all sort of click together. There's cognitive development, which refers to your thinking skills, how you reason and how you move through things logically. Speech and language development, which is really referring to both how you understand and how you use language in an oral and in a written way. Physical development, which most of you will know that we refer to as motor development, and this is about how you use your big and your small muscles. And then social and emotional development, so how we manage and regulate our own emotions and how we interact with other people. Unfortunately, TSC can have a very big impact on child development and ultimately lead to difficulties with adult, psychological and/or psychiatric functioning. We know in TSC that there are some specific factors that can impact on developmental outcomes. These include seizures and related electrical factors in the brain. Physical brain changes, for example, tubers. The individual gene type that a person with TSC has. So we know that, for example, people with a TSC2 mutation tend to do worse developmentally than people with a TSC1 mutation. And then there are some individual child factors that have nothing at all to do with TSC. Things like the history in your family. Is there already an existent history of a condition like ADHD or autism spectrum, for example? Or what happened during your pregnancy or labour, which may have had an impact on child development? The important things to remember are that a very wide variety of difficulties can occur. Now, some people will not have any difficulties at all, which is just fantastic, but most people with TSC, around about 90%, will have some challenges in this area. The combination of problems and the severity of the problems will be unique and different for each person. And in an effort to bring together a really complex area, international working groups have coined this term TAN, which is a real mouthful. It stands for Tuberous Sclerosis Associated Neuropsychiatric Difficulties. Now, this picture was published in The Lancet in 2015 by Curatolo and a group of other people working with that international group. And what they aimed to do was look at the TAN problems on different levels. And you can see that they've divided it into these levels, and then each of those levels have lists of particular conditions or difficulties that might occur. So they've said we know that at a behavioural level, people can experience problems from aggression and temper tantrums through to difficulties with attention or problems with sleep. At an intellectual level, people may experience intellectual disability, or people without intellectual disability might have what we call an uneven profile. So there'll be certain aspects of their thinking and cognition that they do just fine with, but other areas that are really challenging. At a neuropsychological level, we can have problems with specific brain tasks, things like how your working memory is operating or how you go just switching from one task to another. At a psychiatric level, there are the sorts of problems we see as diagnoses, difficulties like autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, or frank anxiety and depression. At an academic level, there are the 3 R's, those learning difficulties that Claire was talking about earlier on, troubles with reading and writing and maths. And then finally, at a psychological level, people with TSC can have problems with self-esteem, and we know that some of those difficulties can extend to their immediate family as well. Having a child with TSC can put great stress on parents and can put great stress on parental relationships. Now, I think this is a really beautiful diagram, and it conceptualises lots of different things very clearly. But I also think that this is important. Now, my diagram isn't anywhere near as pretty or impressive, but these things don't occur in isolation. And what we commonly see is that there is a crossover of difficulties. So it's really important to think about what's going on for that individual. We know about 50% of people with TSC will have an autism spectrum disorder. And we know about 50% of people with TSC will have an intellectual disability. But many of those people with an intellectual disability or ID will also have an autism spectrum and then may have some of those other neuropsychiatric problems we were looking at. People may sit in one of those bubbles on their own, or they might just have 2 of those things going on, or the whole mix. So, knowing that those problems exist, how do we tap into them and how do we identify them? And that's really where the TAN checklist came into being. The TAN checklist is a screening tool which is used to identify areas of difficulty that at any stage of their life people with TSC may be experiencing. But you must remember that the TAN is not a diagnostic tool. So the boxes that you tick on that list that you take into your doctor don't allow your doctor to make a diagnosis of a problem like ADHD or a problem like ASD. They say these are areas in which this person is having some difficulty and we need to explore it further, possibly with additional assessments and further investigation to see if we can arrive at a diagnosis that we then do something about. And importantly, most of the problems that we screen with using the TAN are identified before early adulthood. So childhood is a good time to be tapping into these things. For those of you who haven't seen it, this is what the really squashy version of the TAN looks like. It takes about 10 to 15 minutes to fill in. Oh, you've all got it? It's in the folder. Fantastic. You've got it in your folders there, which is great. There are 12 boxes and the recommendation is you look at doing this once each year, and you'd find that from year to year some boxes will be relevant for your child and your family, and at other years certain things won't be applicable for you. This is really what it looks to identify. So there's a box that focuses on early milestones and helps us to know whether children are achieving the milestones as we expect them to. There's a little box that looks at current function to get a sense of where things are at that point in time. There's a box that looks at behaviour, a box that looks at whether any previous diagnoses have actually already been assigned, a box to tap into school difficulties, one that looks at those specific brain skills we just talked about earlier, one that looks at relationships and self-esteem, and then importantly, there's one that looks at your personal priorities to give you an opportunity to say, this is the thing that's really causing difficulty or grief for us at the moment, and the thing we need some support around. Why would you bother using a checklist rather than just going into the doctor's office and saying, you know, this is what's going on at the moment? We know historically that management of these problems hasn't been done well. In 1998, the first set of international guidelines for management of developmental and psychological and psychiatric difficulties was produced and published. And then there were 3 sets of guidelines in total between 1998 and 2012. In 2010, so more than a decade after that first set of guidelines, a survey that was conducted in the UK by the Tuberous Sclerosis Association found that only 18% of people with TSC had ever received an assessment for a neuropsychiatric disorder, which we estimate to be a treatment gap of about 70% between what people actually need and what's being delivered. And they're pretty awful numbers, really. And that led to the development of the TAND. People stood back and said, we need to do this better. A pilot study of the TAND in 2015, once it was up and underway, which was done with families in the UK and Australia, identified that about 93% of participants had at least 4 TAND issues. And families found it a really quick and a really helpful way of saying, this is what's going on for us at the moment. It's quick and it's easy to fill out, and it focuses everybody on specific difficulties we know occur at high rates and we know affect quality of life. But if we don't think about them and don't ask the questions, then they don't come up as issues. Interventions can improve outcomes, but we can't intervene unless we know what the underlying problem is. Now, the how you use it's the easy part. You've all got one to take home with you today, but for future, it's also freely downloadable on the TSA website, and the address up there is the way to get it. You can fill it in yourself, or you can take it into your doctor with you if you feel you need a bit of backup or support putting it in. Having identified those problems, what do you then do about them? Now, this is just such a big topic, and there'll be time for questions at the end if people feel that there's ground that I haven't covered or specific areas that you'd like to talk about. But I've tried to go through the areas that I see as important and the things that come up again that I see clinically that are really helpful for people. The first thing to keep in mind is that with developmental difficulties, management needs to be as early as we can get it, and it needs to be individualised. Your child isn't a list of diagnoses. Your child isn't ASD or ADHD. Your child is your child with their specific behavioural and developmental challenges. And you need to work out for each individual child where it is they're having specific problems, because that's how you start to build a support framework around them to support them to do the best that they can. And you need to identify each individual child's strengths. They're the things kids are going to want to do, that add to their quality of life and make them feel great.
Stand down, code grey. East building, emergency EBAR room.
The other thing is, as Brett was really touching on before is that a team approach is really important. It's an approach with child and family at the centre, but a lot of people involved. Now, some children may only need access to one or two of these supports, other children may have the whole team involved. And one of the most important things is making sure that all of these people are communicating with each other and talking with each other. Now, sometimes that might be about picking up the phone and letting professionals have a discussion. At other times, it might be about just taking reports along and making sure that they're exchanged. But good communication and having everybody on the same page really does improve outcomes for children. Now, having said that, most areas of developmental difficulty, whether it's global delay, intellectual disability, ASD, ADHD, do have some common ground. And there are critical areas where management plans need to come in and address those things in an individualised way. These include improving the child's communication skills as one of the most important things we can do. Brett touched on my next two. Getting enough sleep for both the child and the parents is really important. And then addressing behavioural challenges. So this first slide is really just a summary of approaches to improving communication skills. But communication is absolutely critical to helping a child convey what they need and to understanding what's going on around them. Now, what this table aims to do is talk about who's able to provide aspects of therapy, what skills, communication skills, they can actually address, and how they can start to do this. And parents and caregivers are really at the top of that list because your role is just crucial. You spend more time with your children than any therapist ever will, and what you do on a day-to-day basis at home with your kids really, really matters. And you're able to address all of those aspects of communication, use of language, understanding of language, and those social communication skills. Through really simple things, making sure that you sing and read with your children frequently so that they're in a language-rich environment. Using every opportunity, and this needs to be pitched according to where a child might be at in terms of their communication skills, but all parents are guilty of wanting to talk to their kids from the other end of the room while you're trying to chop carrots in the kitchen and prepare dinner or fold the laundry or whatever else it is you're doing. But really trying to make sure you take the time to go and be in front of your child, make eye contact with them, talk in short sentences when that's what your child needs, and give them time to be able to respond in their way. There are some really fantastic tips for things that parents are able to do in terms of building communication on the Raising Children website, which was developed here by the Centre for Community Child Health. And I'd encourage you all, when you've got a spare moment, to just log in and have a little look because it's quite valuable. Teachers are also really important. Again, these are people who spend a great deal of time with your children. And having the teachers work in combination with the allied health people, with the speech pathologists and the psychologists, really matters. The best way of having that happen is using an individualised learning plan. So pushing the school to make sure you meet once a term, to have a discussion with the special needs coordinator, your child's teacher, and often your speechy or your psychologist is able to come to that meeting where you can set clear goals about what you're hoping to achieve for that coming term and have a plan for how you're actually going to do it. Speech pathologists are obviously very important in developing communication skills and in offering interventions. And again, they manage all aspects of communication. There are a huge range of programs and different programs that speechies may use to assist with communication skills. Then right through to the things that you will have all heard of, programs like ABA, pivotal response, or in children who are not talking, systems like picture card exchange, signing or iPad devices might come into play. And the speech pathologists are very skilled in knowing how to utilise these. Psychologists are also very important, but their focus here is more on building social communication skills and looking at helping children with overcoming barriers to communication. So other factors that might be impacting, like anxiety, for example. So they may be using those programs that the speechies do, like ABA or pivotal response, or they may be coming in to do things like cognitive behavioural therapy or play therapy to help around those issues like anxiety. And then getting enough sleep. Good sleep is critical to there are so many shaking heads in the audience. It's the holy grail of parenting, really, isn't it? Getting your children to sleep. But it is critical to helping with learning and development, with behaviour and with your own sanity and ability to function during the day. But behavioural programs can be very effective, even for severe sleep difficulties. And some of the things to just think about are having a regular bedtime and a regular wake time. Now, this includes on weekends, and for some children it can mean setting a 6 a.m. alarm 7 days a week. And that can feel like a really awful thing to do if you feel like you're going to get that one lie in, you know, just on a Saturday or a Sunday morning. But for some kids, that Saturday and Sunday lie-in is enough to give them the reserve to kind of power on through the week and throw those routines out. So getting up at the same time each day is actually really, really important. There are the aspects of sleep management that we refer to as sleep hygiene, which is a bit of a ridiculous term, but this really refers to things like making sure there's no screen for a couple of hours before bed. The light that screens emit can lower melatonin levels and make getting your children off to sleep really tricky. Making sure there's no caffeine and thinking about it in those products like chocolate and Coke and so on after about lunchtime, because those things can hang around in your system. And then making sure you have really predictable, gentle bedtime routines that happen in the same way each night. Sleep associations are also a big issue, and if going to bed and having your children with you is what you are happy doing, then you don't need to change anything. But for parents who are cuddling children to sleep, patting children to sleep, having them go to sleep with them in the room, what that means is that children develop an association with that parent and being asleep, so that when they go through those light and deep sleep cycles overnight and come into that light phase of the sleep cycle and stir a little bit, they're very aware that the thing that was there when they first went to sleep, the parent usually, is not there anymore, will wake up fully and then need help resettling. It's a little bit like for adults, if you go to sleep with your pillow under your head and wake up at 1 o'clock in the morning and the pillow's not there anymore, you're likely to rouse completely and need the pillow back under to fall asleep. It's a similar kind of deal for children. There are a whole range of ways of managing sleep associations, and they don't all involve shutting the door on your child and having them cry it out. So it's important to explore these if this is something that's causing difficulty for your family. Remember that there may be other things at play. So for children with high levels of anxiety, for example, they can have a lot of trouble settling at night and may need specific work around the anxiety to be able to settle. And then sometimes medications are really helpful, but I think they should only be used in conjunction with a good behavioural plan and making sure that all of those other factors are being taken into account. And remember that medicines like melatonin are fantastic for sleep onset, so for getting kids off to sleep at the beginning of the night, but they don't keep your children asleep. So if you have issues like sleep association, they tend to still cause problems even in the context of a medicine like melatonin. Then addressing behavioural challenges. Now this is really tricky and it's different for every child. There are some things that will work for some children. There is nothing that works for all children all of the time. But developmental difficulties are frequently associated with behavioural problems. Now, this is because behaviour is a way of communicating, and a lack of understanding, whether it's intellectual disability or language difficulties, can lead to frustration and acting out behaviour, and that's a pattern that we commonly see. Anticipatory anxiety or being worried about what's coming up can often really unsettle some children and again lead to difficult behaviours. And serious chronic illness like TSC can make it difficult to establish routines and to set appropriate expectations. So what can you do? You can improve communication skills and work on improving communication skills and make sure everyone's getting enough sleep. So those two things are really important in managing behaviour. You need to work to understand what the behaviour is telling you and keep remembering that your child is trying to communicate something to you through the particular behaviour that they're demonstrating. And remember that behaviour is a dynamic that relies on that child in that environment with the people around them. So looking to change behaviours and get different behaviours doesn't involve just changing the child. It often involves being prepared to make changes in your own behaviour or look at the environment that child is in and look to see whether modifications need to happen there. So there are no magic bullets, but there are some things that I tend to think of as golden rules in managing behaviour. Getting the environment right is really important, particularly for children with ID or with an autism spectrum disorder. Some environments can be very, very overwhelming for them, and working often not just at home but particularly with your child's teachers at school to make sure the environment for them works is really important. Developing a routine can be very helpful. When you know what's coming up and how it's going to happen, lots of that anxiety just fades away. So having things occur in a predictable way is really important. And when you're changing what's going to happen, giving your children some information about this beforehand. So it's a bit of a know thy child. Some children will get very anxious when they know things are going to change, so you don't want to tell them 2 days out and have them spend the next 2 days being really, really, really worried about that. So some kids it might be best to discuss on the morning of a change. Other children might need a day or so to settle something into their system, but going through with them how you expect things to be different is important. Setting appropriate limits and sticking to them. And this often just involves a little bit of thinking about things beforehand. When you're saying no or asking your child to do something, being certain beforehand that you really do want to say no or that you really do want them to do something matters, because you don't want the temper tantrum or the whinging or whatever else it is to have really kicked in before you then finally say, oh, it doesn't matter, we can do it this time. That kind of approach really turns up the volume on child behaviour and teaches children that they just need a bigger tantrum or more whinging to kind of get you to finally cave in. So when you can stand back beforehand and go, okay, does this matter? Is this a battle I need to fight? Once you've decided on that, that's when you need to stick to your guns and not back down. Having reasonable expectations is important. Kids are kids and they don't get it right all of the time. And again, as the speech pathologist was telling Brett, it is really normal for your children to fight with each other and pull each other's hair and do all of those sorts of things. So know that kids are going to be kids. And know that children with an intellectual disability will have behaviours in line with their developmental level rather than their chronological age as well. So know that you should be expecting from your child what they're able to do in terms of their cognitive function. When things are driving you batty and you really need to change particular things, you need to get your priorities right first and know that 1 or 2 behaviours at a time is about as much as anybody can cope with in terms of making a change. So work out what's important and focus on that, and when you get that right, then you move on to the next thing. Now, medications can be required for behavioural difficulties, but again, like with sleep, only after and then in ongoing conjunction with the right kind of behavioural strategies around them. Okay, now just to talk to you briefly about the DOTS study and change track for a minute. The DOTS study, or the Developmental Outcomes in Tuberous Sclerosis study, is happening here at the Children's Hospital. It's part of a PhD that I'm doing and running in conjunction with Dr. Simon Harvey, who many of you will know through neurology, and Professor Katrina Williams, who is the head here of neurodevelopment. And our focus is really on autism spectrum disorder in TSC. And we're asking 2 particular questions. We're asking, what are the clinical risk factors that contribute to these high rates of ASD in TSC? And what does autism in tuberous sclerosis complex actually look like? Is it the same as regular autism in children who don't have TSC, or is it slightly different, and should we be taking a different approach? We hope that identifying risk factors may allow us to better target medical and surgical therapies and interventions. And the ultimate aim is to be improving quality of life for children and their families with TSC. We're looking to recruit 100 Victorian children between 2.5 and 16 years of age who have TSC. And we're bringing on board participants both with and without developmental difficulties. So it's really important for us to get that spread in the study. We've been identifying families through databases here at the Children's Hospital and sending out information packs. And then I contact families and have a talk to them about the study and see if they're interested in being enrolled. Once children and their families are enrolled, they come in and the children have a series of developmental assessments. We then review previous medical investigations, looking at old MRIs, old EEG studies and genotyping results if they're available. And then we also provide families with a summary report of those developmental assessments too, because we really hope that when families give their time to a project like this, we're able to give them something back that is useful for them. And in terms of acknowledgements for the DOTS study, the Romeos family are here today, and they have done extraordinary fundraising for this project and made an RCH Foundation grant available, which really has made the project possible. So I thank you very much. And the Leslie Eric Paddle Scholarship through the University of Melbourne as well has also been important. If anybody's interested in talking to me about the study, probably the best way is to send me an email and then I can give you a ring, and my contact details are up there. Okay. Questions, comments? Stunned you all into silence.
When you talk about taking this list to your doctor,
Mm.
would that be more your paediatrician, or like I can't imagine taking this to my GP. Sorry, I can't imagine taking this to my GP and saying, "This is what we've found. Where do I go?"
It depends who's already on board for you, I think, as part of your team.
Yeah.
So if you see a general or a developmental paediatrician, that's a really good place to start.
Yeah.
But if at this stage that's who you're filling it in with, I'd also really encourage you to make sure that at some stage when you're in seeing the GP for something, that you take it in. When your children are young, and particularly when you're at a place like the Children's Hospital, you're surrounded by your paediatric neurologist and your paediatrician and the speech pathologist and psychologist and so on. But as your children get older, the GP becomes an increasingly important person in their and your lives. And certainly, I mean, as Claire has pointed out to you today, they weren't able to get somebody to talk about adult hand issues. These sorts of difficulties can be really challenging in adulthood to find people who manage these difficulties, and it often does fall to GPs.
Yeah.
And I think the earlier you start working on building that relationship with your GP and helping to educate your GP about TSC and your child's difficulties, the easier that transition process into adulthood becomes. So yes, I think the paediatrician's a great place to start, but bring your GP on board.
Okay.
It's pretty overwhelming for the GPs. So like I feel, I probably don't need it.
Yeah.
I feel like we've got a good GP on board who actually has a disabled child himself, so has actually been really beneficial for us.
Yes.
But by the same token, they don't like to sort of step in too much because they're aware of the big team that you have, and they're aware that the knowledge they have is so minute compared to the team that you have. So they typically just kind of refer off a bit. So how do you kind of bring it back to a GP who doesn't feel confident in your specialty? Like, do you know, it's...
Yeah, no, it's a really important point. And I think the thing to remember is that you're on a really long journey with them.
Yeah.
So keep them in the loop, keeping them informed, bring them the reports in that the specialists write for you, take things like the TAND in, and over the years as they watch your child from a very small person through to an adult, their knowledge base is going to grow as well.
And is there a way that they can gain more knowledge aside from doing their own research, like something like this but for professionals? Is there a way that they can become more educated on it?
Look, I think there are lots of avenues. I think the TSA Association are fantastic, you know, so that's always a good first port of call, and their website is very good with lots of links to useful resources, not only for families but also for professionals.
Yeah.
There are days like this for somebody who's really got some gung-ho enthusiasm. But also, I think people are always very happy to take phone calls from GPs. So if the GP had specific questions that related to a child development issue, for example, I'm always very happy to have a GP call me to have a chat, as I imagine Simon always is, or you know, the other people who work here looking after children.
Okay.
Yeah.
It just, sometimes they just kind of go, well, this is outside my dealings, I don't want to get involved, that's way too complex.
Yeah.
So it seems crazy to have to refer back to a paediatrician or a specialist all those times when it is possibly something that a GP could manage. But there's kind of that issue between them not feeling like they have that specialist knowledge and also not wanting to step on other people's toes.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and it is a really delicate balance, and there is a bit of backwards and forwards. But as your child gets older, they will take on a more and more important role. Yeah.
Cool.
So,
Thanks.
So just building off what Erin is saying there is, I echo the sentiment that Erin's saying about the GPs, but is there an opportunity then to somehow create a network of GPs that are more proactively interested in getting the knowledge? Because that's a difficult part. So.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think that's something to float with Claire as, as a possibility. And also the RCH transition unit here are doing some amazing work and have really kind of come to being in the last 5 years or so, and are looking to establish links between the Children's Hospital and adult-based community services for families as they transition. And I think you see a bit of a trickle-down effect into sort of general practice and so forth when that happens. So I hope over time that will improve, and that coming together of groups like the transition service here with the TSA group helps to build that kind of a network.
Yeah, and maybe as parents, we've got GPs that we go to today, and if there's some means to connect the ones that we all feel as parents are more proactively involved, that might mean that we travel further to see a GP who's more proactively invested in the condition rather than a GP that just wants to churn and burn the clientele that go through the doors.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the transition unit here are building a database of interested GPs and interested adult specialists in a variety of conditions. So, that's something to work on, Con.
Yeah, I would just like to say Claire would be a great person to talk to about that. I know she has an incredible network of TSC professionals who we work really hard to connect with families. So please do ask her if you're ever looking for a GP. One of the things we also are trying to develop is some more resources to assist GPs in managing your families. Excuse me, I'll just take the microphone over to Simon.
Thanks. I may have mentioned this before, but I think one thing that the society might think about doing is contacting all the medical schools and getting tuberous sclerosis, seeing if it's actually taught. Medical students used to know about tuberous sclerosis, but now when they come to us, they don't. They've never heard of it. And a lot of medical student teaching is done in what's called a problem-based fashion, where they take a particular condition where it's multifaceted and brings in aspects of multidisciplinary care, and frequently involves general practice involvement. And a child with tuberous sclerosis would be a great module to occupy a week. With various genetics and multi-system involvement and all the developmental things. So, if the society Claire was to ring around all the medical schools and just find out, speak to the medical education people, is TS taught, and maybe even present an educational package, so a whole module of information that could be given to the medical schools, and because it might even be the coordinator of education isn't that familiar, but to just highlight it's an important condition. One in 2,000 isn't rare, and that could potentially also be sent on to GP colleges for parts of their continuing medical education.
Thanks, Simon.
Thank you.
I had a question in regards to the list with number 3. If I see other things which are not on the list, for example, very sensitive to sounds, and I found the story very interesting what Brad said with Ollie and the birds waking him up, because I see that issues. I find the most issues are with my son coming from this sleeping and the transition towards into the day, what happens then and when he wakes up, and also, and I don't find any of that
covered in the tan.
In the tent, and what sound the impact has on when he's at schools and hearing all the sounds, or when you're in a busy place. I feel there's something different with how they perceive sounds to how we are. So
Yes.
and I don't see anything of that
of that nature.
of
on
that
there.
nature
Yeah.
in there. So I wonder, I want to
Go
tick
back
that
and
box.
have a little look.
So
I think you're. Thanks, Claire. I think you're right. I was just having a little look over to make sure that there wasn't anything that I thought sort of really covered that. No, so sensory processing difficulties, which is really sort of what we're talking about, occur in children with TSC, they occur in children with autism spectrum disorder with or without TSC, and frequently in people with intellectual disability as well. I guess what you've done is highlight that the TAND is not perfect and it's not going to cover everything. I guess, and I would hope that if it's a really significant issue for you, that would be something that you'd maybe kind of jot down at the end under that sort of personal priorities and go, hang on a minute, this is a thing that causes trouble for us that we don't feel like we've had an opportunity to sort of tick a box for on the list, and it gives you a chance to do that. Also, I suppose, often when children do have sensory processing difficulties, they will manifest themselves in some way that might lead to one of those boxes being ticked. That then means the developmental paediatrician starts to ask you other questions about sensory processing troubles. So kids with sensory processing difficulties will often have behavioural difficulties because they find being in environments where there's too much of a sensory overload really challenging. They may have attentional difficulties because they're investing so much energy regulating all of those things coming in, all of that kind of stimuli, that it's very difficult to attend to the task at hand. They may do things like not make good eye contact with people when they're having a conversation because they're so busy attending to the noise over there, or they catch the man mowing the lawn outside, or the lights were really bright over in the other corner. So there's not a specific box, you're right, but usually if it's going to lead to some kind of a functional problem, you've probably got it covered on there, and otherwise you can go in and ask any question you want and identify any problem you want. You don't have to just stick to the boxes here, yeah.
All right, if there's no other questions, I just want to say, Beck, thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise today. And we've got a little something, just a little token of our appreciation for all you do for our TSC community.
Thank you very much.
All right.